So I thought this was a good way of thinking about where we are today, to talk about the end of the beginning. Because it struck me that we've been looking at charts like this for most of the last 20 years. They always go up and to the right. And now we're getting to the point that we're kind of finishing now. The access story is reaching the end because we've connected 3/4 of people on Earth, and we're going to connect all of the rest. And as we go forward, though, the other part of the story isn't close to being finished. The access story is finished, but the use story is just starting to begin. And it feels like that's what the next 20 years is about. And so most people are online, but most of the money is not. And as we move towards addressing that, we address new problems and we tackle harder markets. And we probably change those markets a lot more than some of the markets we've addressed in the past. And of course, as we do that, we have these two new fundamental layers to build things on. So we spent the last 10 years talking about and building stuff on social and on search. Now we think about machine learning and we think about building things on cryptocurrencies. And so as we go into this, I think it's useful just to start by thinking about market sizes. And so the obvious one, e-commerce, looks big in dollar terms. US e-commerce now is about $450 billion a year. But if you zoom out and look at retail spending, it's still only about 10%. And then if you add bars and restaurants, which of course we're now starting to address, it looks smaller. And then it's interesting to look in some of that and ask what that retail spending looks like. So gas stations, for example, are going to transform and perhaps completely disappear over the next 20 years. And that's as big or bigger than US e-commerce. And then there's other segments inside that as well that are kind of interesting. So we spend over $1 trillion a year on cars and parts and maintenance. All of that is going to go away or change or be completely transformed or relocated over the next 10 and 20 years. But then retail of itself isn't the only story. There's also all the rest of US consumer spending, which is now over $10 trillion. I used to do charts in billions of dollars. This presentation is mostly trillions of dollars. And so then if you zoom out and think about this, the actual share we've taken so far of the opportunity is actually much smaller than it might look just if you look at commerce itself. The same thing comes, I think, if you look at advertising. So internet is now the largest single category in global advertising, and much the same in the USA. It's now close to 40% of US ad budgets. And advertising of itself doesn't change very much over time. It tends to stay stable as a share of GDP. And so this leads to people saying, well, maybe Google and Facebook are topping out. Maybe there's not much growth left for those companies. Maybe they've got everything and there's no room for anybody else. But I think you have to look both at advertising and at marketing, which is this kind of other block we don't talk about so much. And if you look within that block, you see things like direct mail and telemarketing, which it seems kind of weird to me that we talk about a targeted ad on Facebook as advertising, but we don't think about comparing, and we compare that with TV advertising, but we don't compare it with telemarketing or direct mail. And a kind of a broader point to think about here, if you buy space on Amazon, if you buy placement in Amazon search results, then we call that advertising. If you buy exactly the same thing from Walmart, then we call that marketing, and somehow that's not the same thing. But of course it is the same thing, because what we're really talking about, the job to be done, is what you pay to reach a customer. And then if you're thinking about what you pay to reach a customer, there's other pools of capital to think about there as well. So retail rent is money that you spend to reach a customer. It's money you spend instead of marketing or instead of advertising. The same thing indeed for shipping or for service. There are whole pools of capital out there that we've really only just started to address. If you go globally, just sales and marketing, just advertising and marketing in total is now close to $1 trillion. I suspect if you point this out to Jeff Bezos, then that line about your margin is my opportunity starts coming to mind. But this global point, I think, is also interesting, because we really ought to think not just how big the opportunity, but where else the opportunity is. A good place to start in this is with another piece of global technology, industrialization, which, much like the internet, was sort of originated in one country and then spread to another big low-wage country on the other side of the ocean. So this is the UK inventing industrialization, then the UK picking it up, and the US picking it up and taking it forward. But then if we go forward a century, something else has happened. That technology is diffused and it's gone to other places. If we zoom in on that change, where has that technology gone? Where has that change happened? Well, unsurprisingly, most of that balance has gone to China. You can see much the same thing if you look at computing, which was, again, invented in the US and in Europe, but those countries used to dominate it. That was close to 3/4 of computing capacity. Now it's much less than that. And again, of course, a large part of that balance has gone to China, which now has more smartphone users than the USA and Europe combined. You can see the same picture if you look at usage. This is global mobile internet traffic. APAC is much bigger than North America and Western Europe combined. And that, of course, always reflected in the spread of spending power. The global middle class is now a lot bigger than it used to be, but also, again, it's distributed in different places. And that flows through to things like e-commerce. So from almost nothing, China, again, has more e-commerce than the US and Western Europe combined. All of this kind of means that as we look at the position of the US here, penetration of e-commerce is actually quite a long way behind some other leading markets. China obviously is leapfrogging. There's a leapfrogging story there. South Korea and the UK, of course, are also well ahead of the USA, although other parts of Western Europe, on the other hand, are quite far behind. So there's an interesting picture of transition here from this being a US story to it really not being a US story at all anymore. We can see that again in company creation. So these are the 4 big companies we spend all of our time talking about: Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon. And I think it's kind of useful to get a sense of the relative spread of scale and growth and revenue in these companies, because we tend to lump them all together. There's also another company people talk about in this context, which is Netflix. So that's kind of putting that on the chart to the same scale. But I think much more interesting is to think about the 3 big Chinese internet giants, which are smaller because they're not global in the same way, but they are equivalent weight and certainly equivalent growth. But those are just kind of the big giants, the ones that everybody talks about being scared of. It's more interesting, again, I think, to look at how many other billion, 5, 10, 20, $50 billion companies are being created outside the USA. There's a lot of unicorns being created outside of the USA, being created outside of Silicon Valley today. And of course, that's reflected in venture capital, which again was mostly invented in the USA, and relatively recently, the US was really the only place that this happened. Now again, that whole business model, that whole approach has been diffused, and so company creation is also being diffused. That gets us back to the question, well, what's the opportunity? There's US e-commerce, which is $500 billion, and then there's US retail. But then there's global retail, and then there's global consumer spending. So we go from thinking about a couple of $100 billion to $40, $50 trillion of potential opportunity that really means we've only just started scratching the surface of what we might be able to address. How is it that we address that? What kind of things do we do that are different? Does the curve just kind of keep going on up and to the right? Well, it feels to me that things are going to change a little bit. So if we think about the first 20 years of the internet, we really did kind of the easy things. Didn't feel terribly easy at the time. There's kind of entrepreneurs who didn't think it was terribly easy as they were doing it. But what we did was we did stuff that would work with low penetration and would work with little capital. It would work with consumers who weren't comfortable buying stuff online, so they were kind of low-touch goods, things you didn't have to hold in your hand. We tended to build tools rather than build entire stacks. We tended to build information arbitrage. We did sort of price comparison and plane tickets. Now we do things that need high penetration, things that need lots of capital. We invert all of these assumptions. We build complete companies. We build full-stack companies. We build businesses that are based on information. I think a good kind of case study to think about this, a good illustration, is to compare kind of a great company from the last 20 years, like Yelp, with businesses like DoorDash today. Yelp is a low-capital, low-penetration business. It's an information arbitrage business. It's selling tools. DoorDash has to get your hot meal in half an hour. That's a different kind of business with different assumptions about what the internet looks like, what capital you need, what consumers are willing to do, comfortable and comfortable to do, willing to accept doing online. So if we look at that $40 trillion of consumer spending then, there's a whole bunch of things in here that we've only just addressed very peripherally or not really addressed at all. And even where we have addressed them, we're going to address them in the future in completely different ways. So if you think at kind of the first 20 years, what did we do with housing? Well, we did listings and we did price comparison. Now Open Door will buy your house. If you look at transport, we used to do plane tickets. Now we do cars, and we do autonomous cars, and we do Airbnb. Up at the top of the stack with health, well, we used to give you a website that would let you persuade yourself you had the bubonic plague. Now we'll edit molecules, and we'll edit genes, and we'll edit cells, and create completely different kinds of cures. And all the way across the spectrum, we move kind of to a different character of business and a different way of addressing these problems. The most visible place that you can see this happening today, I think, is in retail. And I think a good kind of conceptual model for thinking about retail is that there is retail as logistics, and then there is retail as taste, preference, recommendation, service. And there's a spectrum between these two. And the original Sears Roebuck 100 years ago did retail as logistics, so does Walmart. On the other hand, we've never really managed to scale retail as taste outside big cities and outside small shops. Today, we're addressing both of these. So Amazon did retail as logistics very successfully, and now Amazon and other companies are doubling down on that. So same-day delivery, free delivery, above everything else, groceries. But at the same time, we move across that spectrum, we'd have more and more things that are addressing the other kind of retail that are not just kind of a specialized version of FedEx, but actually a question of recommendation, taste, preference, discovery. All of this change, of course, affects the US probably more than anywhere else because the US has massively more retail square footage than anywhere else. So that picture is likely to change quite dramatically in the next 10 years. Now, as we think about how we address those, I'm actually old enough now to remember when e-commerce was asset light and buying trucks was a really stupid idea and like kind of an exemplar of how everybody lost their minds in the late 1990s. In fact, the original Amazon business plan from 1994 said no warehouses, no stock, no shipping. That didn't last terribly long. In fact, I think it lasted about 3 weeks. But then, of course, Amazon has become well, not really asset light anymore. Amazon has become an infrastructure business. And the thing that drives this change now more than anything else and into the next 20 years is things like groceries. The interesting thing about groceries is that it breaks the Amazon model. In fact, it breaks the whole e-commerce model, because the whole point of Amazon is that everything is a commodity. It's one packet switching network, and they don't have to know what's in the box. They just ship it to you. They just pull it off the shelf and ship it to you. And so it's a commodity platform. And of course, you can't do groceries like that. Groceries needs almost a whole other company. You need different logistics, different delivery, different e-commerce platform, and everything else. But as the chart sort of shows pretty clearly, groceries are so much bigger than e-commerce. It's such a big opportunity that it's worth building almost a whole other company to do that for yourself. Here again, of course, the USA is behind. This is a chart of the online grocery market in billions of dollars. Fairly unsurprising that China is bigger than the USA, because China is apparently quite a big place. What's more useful, I think, is to look at the revenue per capita. So you see other large developed markets that are way ahead of the US here. And so again, you will see really substantial growth in how people do groceries in the USA, kind of catching up with some of these other countries. Again, I think what's more interesting, though, than just the raw penetration is to think about how that changes the industry. So this chart shows you the number of items stocked in grocery stores, in supermarkets, over the last couple of decades. And what you see here is that as the retail model changed, the grocery business changed. The number of SKUs that there were changed, the way that you bought things. And really, the fundamental thing here is when you change how you buy things, you change what people buy. You change the purchasing journey, you change what goes into the basket. As we change that purchasing journey, again, whether that's kind of conventional e-commerce in any other category, but in particular in groceries, we'll change what kind of categories get bought. And so that means money moves around, categories change, money moves from advertising to marketing, as I mentioned earlier. We won't just buy all the same stuff, but on the web, we'll buy different stuff. That, of course, is a good way to think about what happens as we move from just the logistics part to the taste, preference, recommendation, curation part. Now, I think a good way of thinking about this is that the internet lets you buy anything that you could buy in New York. In fact, that's exactly what Sears Roebuck did 100 years ago. It let you buy anything that you could buy in New York, but it doesn't let you shop the way you can shop in New York. And that's now starting to change. We have a bunch of building blocks and a bunch of new ideas for how you might build a consumer internet business that give you different ways of addressing these. So we have social, we have new economic models like rental or subscription. We have this sort of sense that, actually, if you're an online brand, maybe you want to have a shop, and maybe that's a substitute for spending money on Instagram, and so we have different ways of acquiring customers. It feels like an awful lot of current retail rents are going to shift into advertising, and a lot of advertising is going to shift into retail rents. And then, of course, we have machine learning, changing the whole conception of what it is that we might be able to recommend and suggest. All of these building blocks give us things that really shouldn't have worked, or things that would never have worked. 20 years ago, the idea that anybody would buy fashion online was about as insane as the idea that Bitcoin would replace fiat currency. It was just kind of an obviously insane idea. Warby Parker selling glasses online. Are you out of your mind? Cosmetics, makeup that you haven't tried. These are all kind of obviously stupid ideas. These are all things that are now starting to work as we have these new building blocks, as we have more penetration, as consumers are willing to do effectively everything online. Now, this gets me back to the phrasing I used earlier as we think about new problems. Actually, I think the way you could do this chart is, well, what we did in the first 20 years was e-commerce and advertising. What we do in the next 20 years actually is just everything else. What kind of everything else? Well, what does global GDP look like, actually? You can tell I don't like log-scale charts very much. So what does global GDP look like? What pieces of that might we address? Well, how about cars? Tesla, this kind of little Californian company, has been doing quite well lately. You may have read about this. In fact, Tesla is now outselling the other premium car manufacturers in the USA. But if we actually think about the total opportunity for cars, for software, for electric, then again, we get another of these charts that really ought to be a log-scale chart, but actually tells you a clearer story if it isn't. What is the total opportunity here? And again, this is just the USA, not globally, which is even bigger. More interesting, though, than just looking at numbers of cars, I think, is looking at what's inside the cars. So this chart shows you the component cost of a conventional car on the right, which is the OEMs and the tier ones, and then how much companies from the electronics industry are going to eat that. Because as we move to electric, as we move to batteries, and then again as we move to autonomy, you have a completely different mix of components and mix of suppliers inside the car. Software eats the car. More interesting again, though, software changes what the car is. So as we go to autonomy, we change what we think a car is. It won't just look like today's car, but without a steering wheel. It will look different. It will do different things. It will go in different places. We'll unbundle the car journey entirely into different sorts of vehicles, different modalities. What are you going to be doing inside that car if you're not staring at the wheel? Well, you should probably invest in alcohol companies and TV. And TV is another interesting to think about here. Software eats TV. Well, Netflix and Amazon are now top-tier content producers. They have equivalent budgets to the other major US entertainment companies. In fact, this is a great quote from back in 2010 that Jeff Books at Time Warner said this was like the Albanian being worried about the Albanian army. I hope somebody is keeping an eye on the Albanian army now. I think more interesting, though, is to ask, what do we actually mean by TV? So watching people play games is now bigger than Netflix or bigger than HBO or bigger than ESPN. The latest AAA console game had a bigger opening weekend than any of the recent Hollywood franchises. Watching people play games is a big deal. Esports is now of an equivalent size to any of the local US sports, not equivalent to any of the global sports, but the US ones will do for now. But then if you look at the revenue here, this has yet to catch up. And so that's another place where you'd expect to see an awful lot of kind of interesting growth and interesting businesses being created. Going up to the high level, TV viewing is going down. Internet consumption, people looking at their phones, is going up. The tech industry spent 20 years trying to get into the living room, and it did get into the living room, but it didn't do it with TVs, it did it with mobile phones. And so we have this fundamental shift in where the attention is and what kind of things you're going to be doing with that. I've talked a lot about money. Software eats money is kind of an interesting topic to talk. You'll be hearing from Angela later on today talking about this. There's this interesting idea that all the money being put into fintech is enormous, and that's clearly too much, and the market won't be able to absorb this. And yes, there's a lot of money going in. It's just kind of starting to address some of the most obvious pain points. But again, if we think about the overall opportunity, there are trillion-dollar pools of capital here that are going to be addressed by software and going to be addressed by technology. Incidentally, it's worth adding housing from an earlier slide onto this just to get a sense of how much money there is in money. But then as we look at this, there's an awful lot of people still untouched, no matter how big those segments are. A portion of the US population is unbanked, much larger population of the global population is unbanked. And those people will not be addressed by giving them all a paper check and a credit card. They'll be addressed in totally different ways with software, with the internet, with mobile. And in the US, incidentally, there's a lot of people who are sort of notionally banked, but actually aren't banked at all. And there's a common saying here that the US basically has two banking systems. There's a banking system for the people in this room, and there's a banking system for the other people. They get a much worse deal. And that, again, is something that a lot of people are going to think about changing in the next 10 and 20 years' time. As we look at how some of those tools, again, the USA is not in the lead. So on the left, we have mobile payment penetration. On the right, we have mobile payment value. It's fairly obvious that something interesting has happened in China here again, and that's something, again, that's going to start spreading around the world. So we have here a bunch of building blocks, a bunch of new ways of building fintech, new ways of building financial services applications. We have vastly more data. We have completely different kinds of data. We have totally different consumer expectations of what it is that you ought to be able to do and what a service ought to look like. We have the capability to unbundle things from the big traditional conglomerates and aggregators like retail banks. And again, we have machine learning as a new way of bringing understanding to that information. From talking about money, the only thing left is to talk about death. We have a death fund, a bio fund. And drug discovery is $75 billion. This feels like a big market. It's an interesting market. It's one that venture capitalists have addressed for a long time, but it's now being addressed in new kinds of ways. So machine learning, again, a recurrent theme, changes discovery. But things like, more interesting, things like social and wearables change trials. If you actually want to get 10,000 people who have a condition, social means a completely different way of getting those people. Wearables mean a completely different way of monitoring those trials. And of course, we now have ways of actually programming genes and programming cells, which my colleague Jorge will talk about later, that means we can do totally different kinds of cures. But the $75 billion number, but then there's other numbers to think about. So there's drug discovery, and then there's a drug market, and then there's health insurance. But then there's a global market for healthcare, what actually gets spent on you when you're sick, and that's over $7 trillion. How do we address some of those? Well, $7 trillion is spent on healthcare, but that's kind of the cost of being sick. In fact, it's only a part of the cost of being sick, but it's more interesting to think, well, what's the cost of not being sick? What is the value of not getting sick? What's the value of not dying? What's the value of never having to cure any of these things in the first place? And those are things that we can now start thinking about addressing. A good way of sort of thinking about what's happening here is that we've sort of gone through all of the easy monsters, and now we're getting to the to the God mode. We kind of killed the foot soldiers. Now we've got the giant robotic brain with the Gatling gun, and so we're kind of addressing different character of problem, harder markets to address than we addressed in the past. What tools do we have to do that? Well, we have kind of interesting new fundamental layers. If you think about what happened in the first 20 years, we went from these kind of blind alleys of AOL and the information superhighway and interactive TV, and then the internet and the web came along, and this gave us kind of decentralized permissionless innovation. You didn't have to ask AT&T or Time Warner for permission to put up a website, and that was what enabled the explosion. Then it turned out we needed some kind of organizing layer on top of that, and we got Google and we got Facebook, and we've spent the last 10 years thinking about Google and Facebook and how they organize things. And those platforms are centralized by design, and they capture meaning and intent, and therefore can capture value. They're also kind of highly abstracted. They don't really know what a thing is itself. They can only look at it at a kind of 2 or 3 removes. Now we have 2 new fundamental layers. We have crypto and we have machine learning, which, among other things, are a swing away from centralization. What do we mean by that? What would those things do? Well, what is this? Well, how would Google or Facebook or Amazon answer that question? What is this thing? Well, Google will say it's on pages that say Wishbone and Hans Wegner. Facebook will say people who like furniture shared links to this. Amazon will say it's a SKU. I don't understand the question. People who bought this SKU bought other SKUs. And not really very much else. What are we going to be able to do with machine learning? Well, we have more levels of meaning and more levels of understanding. So we will know it's a chair. That would be a good step. We can kind of do that now. We could never do that before. Now we can do that. We can say it's a chair. And then we'll say, well, it's a modern Scandinavian design classic, but actually you go another level of meaning in, and you say, right, well, if you like that chair, you're not going to like Disney Cruises, so we won't show you Disney Cruises ads. We'll show you something else. That's to say, we get to successive levels of meaning of what a thing is, rather than kind of guessing at it through multiple levels of abstraction, from who linked to it or from what page it was shared on. This, of course, is not just a consumer story. If we go back and think about bio, well, machine learning means I can look at an X-ray and tell you whether you've got cancer and do that at massive scale and massive automation. But I can also say it looks like you're going to have a heart attack in the next couple of days. Or I can say, well, change your behavior or you're likely to have a heart attack in the next year or 2. That's to say we get to successive levels of meaning with successive kinds of value and successive kinds of addressability. The fundamental framework for thinking about machine learning, it's a tool to scale people, but to scale people in 2 very different ways. One of them is I have 1 million pictures in the basement, and I now have 1 million interns that I can send down to look at all of those. That's one kind of machine learning. It automates a very basic human task, but something we couldn't automate before. But the other is I have 1 million pictures in the basement. Now I can send one intern to go and look at all of them and come back in half an hour and say, well, when I looked at the third 100,000, this interesting picture started coming out. And so that's to say we get a superpower, in a sense. We get things we could never see before. So we think about machine learning. We also think about crypto. This is a different kind of crypto. Why does crypto matter? Well, imagine in 1993 asking, why does the internet matter? First, you'd have a long argument about whether you should say internet or internets or web or world wide webs. And then you would say, well, this is a distributed, decentralized, permissionless network. Anyone can build anything. You don't need to get permission from the phone company to build this. There's a great story that Steve Jobs said, hey, have you seen this internet thing? We should buy it. It kind of didn't work like that anymore. It changed how this stuff worked. Now, how do we think about what those applications were going to be? Well, we had no idea. So this is web servers and internet traffic in the early 90s. Mac had more share of web servers than Linux, and the World Wide Web was 3% of internet traffic. These were applications built on that network. These were not the important applications. Everything we see now is in that little purple box at the top right. So you had the network and you had the things built on the network. You didn't know what the things were going to be that were important. What was important was the capability. The same thing with cryptocurrency. We have a distributed, decentralized network. Anyone can build applications with native trust, native value exchange, payment, and mechanisms for understanding meaning built into it. So if we come back to this pendulum from closed to open to closed to open, we think about what these things can do. We have new ways of finding meaning and intent, new ways to understand what a thing is and what it might mean that you're interested in a thing, new ways to build networks on that, building networks on that are decentralized, that are permissionless, and also, of course, a market reset. Whenever you have a fundamental change in technology, that just kind of shakes the trees and brings new companies out of that. So a final thing to think about here, I called this presentation the end of the beginning. This is what the beginning looked like. This adorable young man is called Jeffrey Bezos, and he's just entered the books business. This is Jeffrey Bezos today. He is not in the books business anymore. And this is Jeffrey Bezos in the next 20 years and what other things he might be building. So, thank you.